Good afternoon, those of you who have joined us. This is the Maine Center for Coastal Fisheries monthly webinar series. We call it our Lunch and Learn. I welcome you. My name is Paul Anderson. I'm the Executive Director for the Maine Center for Coastal Fisheries. We're based in Stonington, a little nonprofit doing great big things, helping to sustain fisheries and fishing communities in Eastern Maine and beyond. We're very blessed to have a wonderful speaker with us here today. Dr. Nancy Knowlton will be sharing her talk on ocean optimism. A little bit about Nancy. She's a highly decorated, well-known scientist around the globe, got her education at Harvard University and her PhD at the University of California in Berkeley. She's been on the faculty at Yale and also adjunct at Scripps Institution of Oceanography. Lots of great awards and accolades, a member of the American Association for Advancement of Science. She received the Heinz Award recently in 2011. She was elected as a member of the National Academy of Sciences in 2013. And most recently, before retiring, was a Sant Chair for Marine Sciences at the Smithsonian Institution's National Museum of Natural History. We're blessed to have Nancy here in Maine now. She retired up here to Brooksville with her partner. And she's the author of the book you can see on the screen here, The Citizens of the Sea, which was kind of, I guess, a recap at the end of a really important project called the Census of Marine Life. I met Nancy a few years ago and I've gotten to know her, and she's become a board member for the Maine Center for Coastal Fisheries over the last couple of years. So it's great to have you with us, Nancy. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Paul. All right. Well, good afternoon, those of you who are in Maine and wherever else you may be tuning in from. It's really a pleasure to be here to share some thoughts about what's working in ocean conservation. As Paul mentioned, I've had a long career. Most of it has actually been spent in somewhat warmer waters than here in Maine. So I've probably spent more time with spiny lobsters than I have with Maine lobsters, but I'm quickly making up for lost time. And so it's really nice to be here with you all. The talk is titled Ocean Optimism, but I have to be honest and say that's not how my career began. This is a picture that I took actually as a graduate student in 1974 in Discovery Bay, Jamaica, where I had gone to take a course in coral reef biology and geology. And when I was there in the 70s, the reefs looked like this. They were covered with living coral. About 70% of the bottom was live coral. And we thought the reefs were spectacular. Now, of course, we knew they weren't completely healthy in the sense that what's not in this picture. What's not in this picture are lots of fishes, even certainly no big fishes, not even that many small fishes. But at the time, we didn't understand the connection between the fishes swimming over the reefs and the reefs themselves. And we basically scientifically took the reefs for granted. We studied them and other things in them, but we weren't worried about the future of the reefs. Now that lack of worry proved to be a serious mistake, because by the 1980s, those living corals were mostly gone, from 70% of the bottom to less than 5%. And here you see a picture of Discovery Bay taken about 10 years after I first went there. And as you can see, the bottom is covered with seaweeds now, and almost all the live coral is gone. And of course, this loss of the reefs in Jamaica and actually around the world is part of a much bigger picture of loss of ocean ecosystems and damage to ocean ecosystems. And here you can see just some of the headlines that over the last couple of years. Honestly, I could probably go onto Google and search for the last couple of months and equally fill it up with very upsetting, scary headlines about the state of the ocean. So my whole career began with watching a single ecosystem really decline and fall to pieces. And then since then, it's been a story that's repeated itself not only in reefs around the world, but in oceans around the world as well. And so it's perhaps not too surprising that I and my husband, who you see there on the right, Jeremy Jackson, became known on the lecture circuit as Doctors Doom and Gloom, because we talked about what we were seeing around us. I gave lectures with titles like Coral Reefs, Canary in the Environmental Coal Mine, and Jeremy has a TED Talk, which has been viewed over 1 million times, entitled How We Wreck the Ocean. It's really a classic example of hyper doom and gloom, and perfectly justified because of all the bad things that were going on and continue to go on. And of course, it's not even just the ocean. We're facing really this century in 2 huge environmental crises, the climate crisis and the biodiversity crisis. And there are plenty of books that you can read on the situation. These are just 2 examples. And there's plenty to be really, really worried about. So why, you might ask, am I giving you a talk entitled Ocean Optimism? And the reason is that if you present problems without solutions, it typically leads not to action, but to apathy. And I think this is captured really well in this slide from the cartoon from the New Yorker, where the guy's talking to a friend and he's saying, making a difference doesn't make a difference. And sometimes even people working in marine conservation themselves, much less the general public, feel like that's the case, that they're fighting a losing battle. And so my purpose today is to show you that, in fact, that is not the case. Back in 2014, we began this process in a big way with the launch of a Twitter campaign with the hashtag Ocean Optimism. And here you see a screenshot of one such post. And it it's a story about the recovery of an abalone in California. Now, we launched this campaign in 2014. It's since been used by over 45,000 different Twitter accounts. And so I think that pickup really illustrates the hunger people have for acquiring information about what they can actually do to make a difference. And this is not the only such effort. In fact, this whole sense of focusing on solutions has really become a much more prominent part of the conservation conversation since I started it. When I was at the Smithsonian, I helped launch something called the Earth Optimism Summits. And there are many examples now. If you go to the media, you can find solutions pages and or optimism newsletters. Even the TED Talks this year have an optimism theme. So I think really the tide has turned finally. And it's a good thing, because if we only talked, as I say, about the problems and not about the solutions, we are likely to make the problems worse. And so what I've discovered over the course of doing this kind of work and then actually I didn't even begin in 2014, I really started in 2009 with a series of seminars called Beyond the Obituaries. So for over a decade, I've been working on telling the story of what's working in ocean conservation and conservation more broadly. And one of the things I've learned is that there are an enormous number of these conservation successes, but one of the reasons we tend not to talk about them is that most of them just aren't that well known. And so what I'd like to do is take you on a journey around the world to share some of these successes, which involve saving species, protecting spaces, eating wisely, restoring lands and seascapes, reducing pollution, improving human lives, and also a bit towards the end at what might be on the horizon. And the stories that I'll talk, and each one only briefly because of limited time, are shown, the locations are shown on that map. And I'm going to begin with that special star in the northeast of the United States called Maine. So the first story in Maine that I'd like to tell is the recovery of Maine's puffins. Now, puffins used to be common on the coast of Maine, but really excessive hunting led to a situation where there's just one nesting pair on the entire coast. Now, this was partially helped by the passage of the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, which stopped the hunting, but even when the hunting stopped, the birds didn't return. And they eventually returned thanks to the science and the determination of Dr. Stephen Kress, who realized that puffins aren't very happy when they're all by themselves on rocky islands. They really like to have other puffins around them. It makes them feel more secure. And as a consequence, he set up a restoration program to recover puffins, which involves putting small wooden puffins on the rocks and playing puffin calls from the rocks, and even jumpstarting the recovery process with a few baby puffins from elsewhere. And the result has been a really spectacular recovery of puffins. Now there are hundreds of nesting pairs, and you can easily enjoy them by taking a tour to visit them, for example, on Eastern Egg Rock, which was the center of one of the biggest recovery effort. So this is an example where not only have the puffins recovered really strongly, but also there's a benefit to the people of Maine who host the tourists that come to see them, because puffins definitely qualify as one of the cutest birds on the planet, and people like to go on boats and visit their colonies. Second way that Maine is really succeeding is in protecting its shorelines. This is a very, very recent example, the purchase of Pond Cove Island, which is going to be made part of Rook Bluffs State Park. And it's a project of the Maine Coast Heritage Trust and also Ducks Unlimited. I mentioned Ducks Unlimited because that's a group that's also involved in hunting. And it's an example of the importance of protecting shorelines for all sorts of different activities, including regulated hunting and recreational use. So this is not nature just locked away all by itself. It's nature for the people who want to visit it. Another really old success, which certainly affected Maine, was the banning of DDT in the United States in 1972, thanks to the book that Rachel Carson wrote in 1962, Silent Spring, which was really the beginning of the modern environmental movement in the United States. And Maine is still very fortunate to have, is a very special place in Rachel Carson's legacy. The result of the banning of DDT has been a dramatic increase in the Maine's birds of prey, the ospreys, and as you see here, the bald eagles. That's because DDT was accumulating through the food chain, concentrated at the top of the food chain, and in the case of birds in particular, caused their egg shells to weaken and led to catastrophic nesting failure. As a consequence of banning DDT, however, these birds have really dramatically recovered, to the extent that I think if you asked a young person, if they weren't aware of the history of DDT and its banning, might never realize that bald eagles were once in serious risk of going extinct. Here's another example of bringing the rivers back to health in Maine. And that picture on the right I took, it's a stream that's actually quite near where I live. The reason rivers are important to oceans is because there are many species of fish that actually move back and forth between the oceans and freshwater, including the alewife, which you see here. Alewives move up streams to spawn in small lakes, but with the building of multiple dams, both large and small, across Maine's rivers, the alewife populations collapsed. They are now really rebounding, thanks to major efforts to return natural flow to Maine's waters. And this benefits not just the alewives, but also the many organisms that feed on alewives, which include not only bald eagles, but also striped bass, which is a kind of fish that we as humans like to enjoy as food. So switching to the opposite side of the United States, there are a number of success stories in California as well. I was a grad student in California and actually worked for 9 years at the Scripps Institution of Oceanography. And so I'll tell a few stories from California. Here's one of the California sea otter. This sea otter, particularly the southern populations, was so extremely overhunted that it was thought to be extinct. They found some survivors, they were protected, and now these sea otters are so common that they're really a major tourist attraction. It's part of what makes visiting Monterey Bay so much fun. And you can see the charts on the right, which show the recovery just from 1990, but the recovery over the entire history of the effort of protecting them is, of course, much stronger. Here's another example from California. The California Marine Life Protection Act resulted in the creation of 124 marine protected areas. moving from 3% of the coastline protected to 16% of the coastline protected. Now there's definitely interest and scientific evidence to support the eventual increase to 30%. So it's a movement called 30 by 30. So increasing protection to 30% by 2030. And California certainly has illustrated the benefits of this level of protection, because with these marine protected areas have come the recovery of a number of important fisheries, such as rockfish. Another step that California took early on in 1994 was to reduce bycatch by banning nearshore gill nets. These were really a problem because large fish would swim into shallow water to spawn. They would get caught in the nets. And the one thing you really don't want to do in a fishery is remove a lot of the breeding individuals from the population, so that there are no, so it makes it very difficult for the populations to rebound. The result of this step has been, again, a dramatic increase in the commercial catch, but also in the recreational catch, which you see illustrated by the photo on the right. And then finally, moving to the Gulf of Mexico, there have been some very important examples of cleaning up waters, in particular reducing the amount of nutrients in waters. And this is an example from Tampa Bay, which about 6 years ago announced that finally seagrasses had returned to 1950s levels. So it's not an easy thing to accomplish, required a lot of actions to reduce nutrients coming into the bay, but the result has been a success. The map on the right in green shows the cover of seagrass, which is almost in all the places that it used to be in 1950, which is shown in red. Now, this is not only good for the seagrasses, it's also good for the other organisms that live in seagrasses, including fish, which again, we like to eat. And very importantly, seagrasses are an important way of reducing carbon dioxide pollution in the air because they are capable of sequestering carbon. They're very important in that respect as a climate solution. I'll talk a little bit more about climate a bit later in this talk. Here's a map and some graphs showing the recovery of sea turtle populations. I'm sure many of you have heard about the hunting of sea turtles. They're being caught in nets, and also the hunting of the eggs because they come to land to lay their eggs on beaches. And so I'm sure many of you have heard about the plight of the sea urchins, but perhaps some of you don't know that actually, thanks to really concerted recovery efforts in many parts of the world, 12 of the 17 populations of sea turtles are actually now increasing. And some of these increases, as you see on the graph on the right, are really dramatic. Now, it's not to say that there aren't populations that are still in trouble, in particular the leatherback turtles, sea turtles of the Pacific are in serious condition, and there's some other populations as well. But overall, the story for sea turtles is actually one of really surprising level of conservation success. Turning to the protection of marine areas, marine protected areas, I mentioned the California steps to create marine protected areas in 2030. Here's an example of a very large marine protected area, the Ross Sea in Antarctica. In fact, it's the largest marine protected area, or certainly was when it was established. And actually in the last couple of weeks, there have been announcements for the to move to protect two additional areas in Antarctica, which are examples of what I would call the big and remote protection strategy. Big because the larger a marine protected area is in general, the more benefits you can achieve. But also when they're remote, they're actually a little bit easier to protect because there are fewer competing uses for those areas. But it's not just big and far away places that are being protected. This is a picture I took from Hong Kong. I spent 3 months there as a visiting professor over a course of 3 years at Hong Kong University. And this is a picture of the Mai Po Park, which is nestled between Hong Kong and Shenzhen. It's only 6 kilometers squared, and it's surrounded by 19 million people, but nevertheless, it's home to 60,000 birds and 350 different species of birds. It's a very important conservation strategy in an area where much of the coastline has been very severely urbanized. It provides critical habitat for birds as they move up and down the coast of the Asian Pacific. Here's an example of reforestation and more broadly speaking, an example of restoration. We have done so much damage that we can't simply just reduce the stresses and hope that things come back on their own. In many cases, we really need to give them a jump start to speed the process along. And this is an example for mangroves in the Philippines. It's a project that's run by the Zoological Society of London. And as you can see, it doesn't take many years if you do this kind of reforestation properly to go from just tiny little seedlings to an actual substantial mangrove forest. And like seagroves, mangroves are very important as potential ways to address the climate problem because they are also really good at capturing carbon and storing it in the sediments around their roots. Here's another example of restoration, which involves removing rats, particularly from islands where they have been devastating wildlife around the world. And so I've shown here pictures from two examples, one from Palmyra Atoll, which is in the tropics, and one from South Georgia Island, which is between South America and Antarctica. And in both cases, removing rats has resulted in a dramatic recovery of the seabird populations there. And these are two examples, and there are quite a few other examples where restoration by rat removal has been successful. Now, of course, seabirds are part of the marine ecosystem, but it's more than that. On a place like Palmyra, the seabirds forage widely in the ocean around the atoll, but then return to the island to rest and to breed. And when they return, they poop from the food that they captured while flying away from the island. And that poop dissolves when it rains and runs off into the ocean. And it's been shown that actually for reefs in many different places, removing rats causes not only the recovery of the seabirds, but also healthier coral reefs because of the nutrients that are returned to the coral reefs thanks to the recovering populations of seabirds. Here's an example from South America in Chile. It's a community cooperative to harvest what are sometimes called Chilean abalones. They're not actually abalones, but like abalones, they're a very highly priced delicacy. And these cooperatives are work in terms of small groups of people getting together and among themselves determining what is a sustainable level of harvest. And it's not just the abalone, it's been shown around the world that these bottom-up cooperative efforts to manage marine resources and resources really in general, not just marine resources, is much more successful than top-down approaches. And of course, here in Maine, we see an example of that in the way that the lobster fishery is managed as well. So it's really a classic case of community cooperation to manage things in a sustainable fashion. It's been actually well studied by social scientists interested in how these cooperative agreements work. So in Chile, in Mexico, in Maine, and many other places, you see evidence of sustainable use of marine resources through small-scale local cooperation and management of the resources in their vicinity. But of course, sometimes we need to cooperate on a larger scale than just a village in Chile or a small area in Maine. And perhaps the textbook case of successful cooperation is the cooperation that took place in getting rid of the threat to the ozone layer in the atmosphere. Now, it wasn't that long ago, 50 years ago, that chlorofluorocarbons, or CFCs, were really common in refrigeration and in aerosols. But in the 1970s and the 1980s, it was discovered that these compounds were eating a hole in the ozone layer and doing really, really serious damage. There was a massive media campaign, and demand for aerosols in the United States, for example, dropped dramatically. In 1978, the Environmental Protection Agency banned EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency banned the CFCs from many uses. Industry developed alternatives. In 1987, Congress voted to ask President Reagan to act on the issue. And in 1987, the Montreal Protocol was signed, which implemented freezes and cuts, and in addition, help for developing countries. In 1990, taxes were imposed on these compounds. And it's now estimated that not only has the ozone hole been substantially repaired with the full recovery expected by the middle of this century, but 2 million cases of skin cancer have been avoided by 2030. And also this turns out to have helped address some of the issues with the climate as well. So this is perhaps one of the most amazing examples of communities getting together both nationally and internationally to solve a very, very serious environmental problem and doing it quite effectively. So this brings us to the problem that really has replaced the CFCs, and that's that of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. I'm sure I don't need to belabor the point that this compound is causing global warming, and in the ocean, it dissolves and makes the water more acidic as well. And so what I'd like to do is talk a little bit about how the world and as a global cooperative effort, but also nationally and individually is coming to grips with this problem. It's far from solved, but things are much more promising than they might have seemed, say, 5 years ago. So on the left, you see a picture of my home. It has solar panels, and in the driveway is my all-electric car, which is charged on sunbeams. Now this makes me feel really good, but what is really important is doing this on a larger scale. And so there you see an extensive wind facility, which is going to power 590,000 homes in Great Britain. This isn't something that's being talked a lot about in the Northeast, because it is undoubtedly the case that these kinds of energy generation facilities are coming to the waters of the near us and along the eastern seaboard, because there is a lot of wind energy to be captured. So these are controversial and complicated issues, but I think it's important to remember that the reason for these wind farms is to prevent a much more catastrophic situation in terms of uncontrolled release of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere through the burning of fossil fuels. One of the reasons this has been possible is that the cost of renewable energy has really dropped. And here you see the costs of various kinds of energy, and notice in particular the cost of wind in blue, which has dropped to some extent, and then really strikingly, the cost of solar energy through photovoltaic panels has really dropped dramatically. And note in particular the timeline here. This is only 2009 to 2018. And yet there's been this huge drop in the cost of solar power, which is why it's becoming more and more common to see solar power as part of the energy mix, as well as wind power. Now, as I mentioned, I have an electric vehicle. In the United States, we're really not yet doing that well with electric vehicles. Part of the issue is price. They still remain somewhat more expensive than gas vehicles, although not that much more, but there's also the huge issue of charging infrastructure. And to give you a personal example, when I made my appointment to get my vaccine, it was in Presque Isle, which is in the northern part of Maine. And I was unable to drive my electric vehicle to Presque Isle because there's no place to charge it en route. And so I had to drive it to Bangor, park it in the airport, and then rent a car and drive from there in a gas vehicle to Presque Isle to get my 2 vaccination shots. Obviously, a more ample infrastructure for charging vehicles will make a big difference. And I show you here data from the use of electric vehicles in Norway, because I think it's so striking in terms of the success they've had. It's now the case that greater than 60% of the new car registrations in Norway are electric vehicles. And they have accomplished this not only through making it very easy to plug vehicles in to charge them, but also through reducing the taxes on electric vehicles, reducing fares on roads and ferries and parking, and even some paybacks for scrapping gasoline vehicles. So this goes to show, these data show that when a nation or a region makes a commitment to electric vehicles, the results can be dramatic. And I will say personally that my electric car is the most fun car I've ever had to drive. It is like a little bit like driving a rocket ship. It's so responsive to stepping on the so-called gas pedal, which is of course not a gas pedal anymore. And so those of you who haven't had a chance to drive an electric car, I encourage you to do so. Finally, I'd like to say a little bit about the benefits to people. I've mentioned this in a couple of different cases. Here's an example from Cabo Pulmo National Park in Mexico. It was begun as a local village getting together and realizing that they were fishing harder and harder for fewer and fewer fish, and they were really on a road to nowhere. So they set up this small protected area, which has resulted in a dramatic rebound in fish populations. But even more importantly, instead of being dependent on harvesting fish to sell at a very small scale and to feed their families, is now a major tourist destination in Baja California. And the incomes of the people in Cabo Pulmo have dramatically increased as a result. And then this is another example of the importance of conservation. This may seem a little remote from the ocean. It has to do with sewage, but of course all sewage that goes into rivers eventually goes into oceans. And in many parts of the world, it's simply too expensive to lay down sewer pipes. And this is true of Nairobi, Kenya, where this Sanergy company works. And what they do is franchise clean portable toilet facilities, and so individuals own them and make a small income. And the waste is collected and then it's processed and turned into organic fertilizer, which is then sold to farmers who report greatly increased yield. So this is a wonderful example of a circular economy and increasing human health and dignity by having clean sanitary facilities. There are lots of things on the horizon that I don't really even have time to go into in great detail. There's enormous work being done on the genetics of marine organisms, trying to figure out ways of making them better able to cope with the warming that is really committed by the amount of carbon dioxide we've already released into the atmosphere, to assist them in the process of making it through this essentially stress bottleneck, after which hopefully people will have gotten things under in a more manageable and sustainable fashion in terms of their daily activities. So there's enormous work being done in the basic sciences on this. There's also incredible work being done financially. And you see here a news story of the payout of an insurance policy, which was triggered by the damage to the reef caused by a hurricane in Mexico. And there are other very inventive debt for nature swaps being engaged in now as well by the Nature Conservancy, for example, in the Seychelles. And these creative financial mechanisms make it much more easy to achieve very large marine conservation goals. There's also, I hope, but this is still a little bit in the future, what I would describe as the plastic revolution. There are places like Tanzania where I visited just before the pandemic started, actually, where plastic bags and bottles are literally banned. And so you drink, all the bottles are in glass and you don't have plastic bags. This seems shocking, but this is actually the way the world was when I was a child. So there certainly seems to be the potential of going back to that more sustainable situation with plastic. There are some developments in terms of capturing plastics, particularly in rivers, which is where a lot of the plastic enters the ocean. It's much easier to capture plastic when it's concentrated in rivers than once it gets out into the open ocean. And then finally, there are countless young innovators and entrepreneurs working on alternatives to fossil fuel-based plastics, which not only would not use fossil fuels, but also would be truly biodegradable. And here you see just one example on the right. So I'd like to end with just a few lessons. The first is that change can now come really quickly. There's a wonderful quote from Bill Gates, which is that we overestimate the change that will occur in the next 2 years and underestimate the change that will occur in the next 10. So sometimes seems like nothing is really happening very fast, but then once things start to happen, they really go quickly. And to give you a sense of how the pace of change has changed over time, here are three different social policies that have changed dramatically since I have been an adult. So the first has to do with interracial marriage, which was banned, which was permitted by just a handful of states, in 1787, but it took 180 years for it finally to become federal law that interracial marriage was legal. Women's vote, from its initial activism and the change in single states to federal action, took only 30 years. And then finally, the work on marriage equality and making that legal at the federal level took only 12 years. So it really gives you a sense that even though some of the changes that we need to make are very, very large, our ability to change quickly has improved dramatically. The second lesson is that anyone can make a difference. There's a wonderful African proverb: if you think you're too small to make a difference, you haven't spent the night with a mosquito. I think it could also be a Maine proverb as well. And one particularly prominent such change maker, of course, is Greta Thunberg. But what's really encouraging about change these days is Greta is not by herself. There are literally thousands of activists around the world working on the biodiversity crisis and the climate crisis, and it gives me a lot of hope. I just read a recent article that said that New York, about a group of kindergartners who now, who I think they're now preteens, but they started activism against the use of toxic pesticides in New York parks when they were kindergartners, and New York State has now changed its policy. So even kindergartners are making a big difference. The third lesson I've learned is the importance of reaching out beyond the audience you're used to working with. These are two projects I was involved with. On the left is a crochet project run by the Institute for Figuring, which really, through the use of this creation of this large crocheted structure, part of it was healthy and colorful, part was made out of plastic to symbolize pollution, part was white to symbolize coral bleaching, brought all sorts of people into the Natural History Museum where it was displayed, and really broadened the audience from people who are just interested in animals as a matter of course to, say, people in the crafts community. And then on the right, you see a project that was initiated by the Vatican that I helped to be at one point was part of, and that's another example of a community of people now spearheaded by Pope Francis with his proclamations that are really working for sustainability as well. Lesson 4 is that there will be failures and setbacks and compromises and trade-offs. And so it's very important to remember Voltaire's quote, which is, "Don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good." You see two examples here: the runoff of toxic materials from mining for the materials that we need for electric car batteries. And on the right, the discovery of what appears to be about 25,000 barrels of DDT off the California coast. These are not good news, but they're not. But this kind of thing is really the way conservation works. There are always going to be these things. So you just have to recognize that life isn't perfect, but that doesn't mean that things can't improve. And then finally, to focus on the solutions. I think it's no accident that Martin Luther's "I have a dream" speech is so powerful, because it is "I have a dream," not "I have a problem." And one of the most inspiring things about the young people that are working in conservation these days is they also have a dream, and they're really fighting for the solutions and not just talking about the problems. So just a few final things to wrap up. If you want more information about the ocean, I encourage you to consult the Smithsonian's Ocean Portal website, which I served as editor-in-chief in for a number of years. It's a great source of information about all things about the ocean. Also, I encourage you to buy my book. It's not an expensive book, and the profits actually all go to the Smithsonian. And it tells many, many stories about ocean life and how the crazy creatures that make a living in the ocean do so. And I've found from looking at the reviews that many people buy it not only for themselves, but also for their kids and their grandkids, which wasn't the audience I was originally intending, but I'm glad there are so many young marine biologists out there. And then finally, a recent article that was published by David Montgomery in the Washington Post on the role of hope in the environmental movement, which is, I'm a small part of it. It's a really interesting set of interviews and a really powerful essay on the importance of not always focusing on the doom and gloom. And then finally, for those of you who are on Twitter, there are lots of resources there. You can follow me at Sea Citizens, or you can follow at Earth Optimism, which is the official Twitter account of the Smithsonian in this area. And then just look for hashtag ocean optimism and hashtag Earth Optimism if you want some examples of success stories. I make it a point, I will say, to never start my day without finding an example of something positive, and never going to bed at night without ending with something positive as well. It's a very healthy practice, I find. So with that, I will say thank you and entertain any questions that you might have.
Thank you, Nancy. That was wonderful. Great, a great message of optimism that we all desperately need these days and forever. So thank you so much for that. Folks, you're welcome to use the chat feature or the Q&A and ask a question. I have one, Nancy, that I actually got emailed to me. It's from a friend in the Blue Hill region, Tony Ferrara. It's a kind of a climate change related question, so see what you can do with this. Is it accurate to say that the ocean is a heat sink, sequestering much of the heat from the atmosphere, but as it continues to warm, will it be less effective in removing heat from surface temperatures? And secondly, at some point, could that heat transfer process reverse and end up adding heat to the surface temperature?
It's definitely the case that it is a heat sink, and it has saved us living in the air from quite a bit of warming by capturing that heat and sinking it into the ocean. It's also the case that that heat capacity is not unlimited. The last part of your question, I would have to defer to a physical oceanographer. I've never heard of the concept of the heat actually starting to get so much warmer than the air that it would actually start warming the earth. But maybe there's a physical oceanographer in the audience. I think that's less of a risk, more that there are limits to what the ocean can do. And then also the other thing is, of course, one of the things in the process by which it saves us from global warming is absorbing carbon dioxide, and that's making the ocean pH get lower and lower. And this is not without really substantial costs. I think at the moment, the cost to ocean life from the heating is more severe than the cost from ocean acidification, but there are places already, particularly, for example, shellfish hatcheries, where the baby shellfish, the little tiny clams and oysters, are very sensitive to this even slightly lowered pH. Normally, the pH in the ocean is very well buffered, which is a term that scientists use to say that it really doesn't fluctuate that much. And so when I was a student, no one ever even talked about changes in ocean pH, because it was just inconceivable that we would have an impact on the pH. That's clearly not the case. But it does mean that organisms aren't very good at dealing with large decreases in ocean pH and making the ocean more acidic. So I think for coral reefs, for example, which is the ecosystem that I know best, the mortality from warming has been much more severe than the mortality from acidification to date. But unchecked, acidification could pose really serious threats in the future.
Okay, thanks for that question, Tony. We have a few more here.
I think
David is asking, what was the species of fish held up on the beach in California? There's a large fish. You were talking about apex predators.
I am not sure. Sorry, I'm a coral biologist, not a fish biologist.
There's a large vertebrate.
I will, if you send your email, I know people I can ask. So if you send me your email to the MCCF, they'll pass it on to me and I'll get you that answer.
Yeah, do that, David. We'll find that for you. Just a comment from Mike Timpson saying, pointing out that there was an article in The Guardian yesterday about the history of solar panels and the big price drop in the last few years, which your graphic clearly demonstrated. I assume that has to do with materials and technology.
Yeah, I mean, it's not just solar panels. For example, the price of LED lighting, which is a dramatically more efficient way of lighting than the classic, Thomas Edison light bulbs. Those used to be really expensive, and the cost of those has also dropped precipitously. The cost of electric vehicles is dropping precipitously. Whenever something becomes, produced in large amounts, there are usually cost efficiencies. And we're seeing just the beginning, I think, of an energy revolution that, say, 10 years from now, there are going to be things happening, things that are common now that we're not even thinking about at the moment.
John Waldman asks a question that resonates with something I was going to ask you, actually. And essentially he's saying, can well-meaning NGOs leverage funding on good news?
Oh, yes. And I think that is actually happening more now than used to be the case, because I would say that the NGOs were like the rest of us, the scientists. We spent a number of decades really just banging our fists on the table saying, this is terrible, this has to stop. I think now there's much more, just across the board. I mentioned the media, but NGOs as well, and scientists as well. There's just like a laser focus on solutions. And part of talking about solutions is talking about the ones that have actually paid off and have resulted in successes. And sometimes I do get frustrated that it's a tendency. I think it's sort of a human tendency. When you solve a problem, you sort of move on to the next one. You don't really take a step back and say, look, we did this. And that's part of what the ocean optimism and earth optimism movements have been about, is really trying to make sure we shine a spotlight on these successes, which, as I mentioned, many of which are very poorly known. The example from Tampa, I think, is really a classic one, which was that story was announced in the mass media in 2015, and like all stories, it popped, bounced around for about a day or two and then vanished. And as a result, I happened to find it. And so I started talking about it. But I found that when I was giving talks, even to marine conservation professionals, many of them had never heard of the success story in Tampa. And in fact, I even gave a talk in Tampa to a group of 200 scientists who work in the Gulf of Mexico. And it was on ocean optimism. And I say, and how many of you know that right outside the window there in Tampa Bay, there's this amazing success in terms of restoring seagrasses? And of the 200 people in the room, only 4 people raised their hands. Wow. I think I think it's gotten a lot better, but that was part of what motivated me initially to really focus on not just the possible solutions in the future, but the things we already have accomplished. Because in some ways, I think those are, for people who are trying to make a difference, I think those are as inspirational as the ones that are sort of just out of reach at the moment.
Pam is asking a question, and actually another somebody else is asking a similar thing, and we'll combine them. So Pam is saying, wondering what example of a success story you hope to be able to tell in another 5 or 10 years. And the second piece of that is, are there projects that are recommended that we as citizens can participate in to help make a difference?
Well, of course, there are projects everywhere. And I urge you to contact Maine Center for Coastal Fisheries for one of them. Actually, Maine Center, I'm on the global board and actually on the Maine chapter of the Nature Conservancy. And Maine Center for Coastal Fisheries and the Nature Conservancy work hand in hand in alewife restoration, which I think is a great example. And there's a lot of citizen science that goes on as well. But, you know, I always tell people to, you know, poke around on the internet and check out the various things that you can find, and figure out a good match between what really makes you excited and where you feel like your own personal skills could make a big difference. You know, in terms of the success stories that I want to see happen in 10 years, the two that I really feel are critical. One is energy. And although I talked a lot about all these amazing changes that have happened, and every day there's a new, as I say, go on Twitter and look for various people who post on what's happening with renewable energy. And there's just every day there's good news. That said, it's not big enough and it's not fast enough. And so I hope that 10 years from now, the energy solutions which are cropping up piecemeal around the world are really at scale. And so that we actually are managed to meet these commitments that we're making now to really substantially lower the amount of carbon dioxide emissions, because the amount of change that's required is actually very large. I feel optimistic that we can do it, but it's not like it's going to happen without working at it. And then the other one, which I did mention, was the plastic problem. And that we still, unlike the energy problem, where I feel like in a way we know exactly how to make it happen and we really have tools in our hands to do it. The plastic problem is still one where in some cases, we don't have good substitutes or good strategies for handling all the waste. And that I'm hoping that, I don't think we'll have solved the plastic problem 10 years from now, but I'm hoping that the plastic problem 10 years from now is where the energy problem is today, where, in other words, that I can see what the solution looks like. And it's just a question of stimulating the change so that it's bigger and faster. And then, of course, there's also, I mean, the third thing is the biodiversity crisis, which I don't want to shortchange. And marine protected areas are a big part of that, but there are all sorts of other things. I don't want to see, the worst thing about it, you know, the extinction is that it really is, for all practical purposes, a forever loss. And I view, if I think about sort of the conservation trajectory, I think things are going to get worse before they get better, but we're essentially going to go through a sustainability bottleneck. And in terms of biodiversity conservation, I want as many of those species around when we get through that bottleneck so that they can really recover. If we lose them, then we've lost them.
Here's an interesting one that is very poignant right now. What's being done to work with lobstermen, getting them to embrace ocean wind farms?
Well, I should actually, Paul, why don't you answer that question? You're really in the thick of this. I do feel, I'm going to say a few words, and then Paul, I really would like you to reply. All conservation success depends on trust. And trust is not something you can buy at the hardware store and install. It is something you have to work hard to build. And so that I personally feel that the steps that we'll need to take are not going to be ones that will have serious negative implications for the lobster fishery in terms of wind farms. But my saying that doesn't make it so. And these are conversations that need to be had. So Paul, why don't you say a few words about that?
Well, absolutely. It's a challenge for any of the fisheries to try to understand something so complex when it feels like it's a threat, and they feel like they may lose some access to their grounds, and there may be unknown ecological impacts. What is unfortunate, and I've been paying a lot of attention to this, is the process that is in play right now is a process that fishermen aren't often part of, and they're being invited to participate in a conversation about what feels like an imminent set of decisions that may have already been made, and so getting to that trust is pretty hard if it feels to the fishermen that they're not really being listened to. I attended the rally in Augusta the other morning, and I was really impressed at every one of the speakers that got up there. They were polite and respectful. They were expressing urgency, and they were prepared with some really good questions that deserved to be asked and deserved to be answered. So unfortunately, it really is a process thing, and we in the planning and government world are quite comfortable in that process, and we work our way through these things, and we feel like we're getting to solutions. I think we have to adjust the process if we really want a collaborative set of solutions and a collaborative vision to come out of this, and to make sure that we're honestly taking those concerns at heart and answering them as well as we can with science and technology and creativity. It's going to be a tough go, but it's really, when I talk to fishermen and fishermen leaders, they know climate change is happening. They're not all of them are denying that by any means. They know there needs to be solutions for power for the planet, but the trade-offs are in place, and they want to make sure everybody understands what the implications of those decisions will be.
Yeah, I mean, it's getting people to sit down and talk to each other is an absolutely vital step in making any kind of conservation progress. And so I really appreciate the work that the Marine Center for Coastal Fisheries does in being that group, in that entity that really links different stakeholders in this issue together and trying to grow those conversations. I can't, the message from social sciences is unequivocal. You cannot achieve success without bottom up efforts. Yeah. And for bottom up efforts, you have to have trust and engagement and a shared commitment.
All right, well, we're about to close, but a couple of quick comments. A couple of friends have written in. Zach Cliver, who is a friend and has worked in the cetacean biology world for a long time. And absolutely, Zach, he just makes the comment of how can we work together through MCCF to bridge some of these gaps around complex problems. So absolutely, Zach, let's talk. I heard you on the radio a couple of weeks ago, and that was really good. And also a friend, Pam Pearson, reminds us all that there are political buttons that can be pushed through our Congress and senators, and she talks about the American Jobs Plan and how that could help achieve what Norway achieved that you just described, Nancy. So hello to Pam, and thanks for those comments. That's all we have there, but it's actually the end of our hour anyway. If you can take this one here, this is from another colleague, Jeff from TNC. Did you see the Seaspiracy film? And do you have any observations on that?
Oh, that's a 10-minute answer in itself.
You apparently did see it.
I did see. I didn't actually watch the whole thing. I watched it because I knew somebody was going to. I watched the first half of it at least. I'll probably at some point sit down and watch the whole thing. Is there, on the one hand, are there problems with giant industrial fisheries that aren't being addressed that are causing enormous damage to the oceans? Yes. I mean, is the film successful in the sense that it's gotten a lot of attention? Yes. Was it necessary to have the film be so full of inaccuracies, large and small? No. So everything from the, the quick one-off statements that, for example, if the whales die, the oceans will die. Now, I don't want to see the whales die, and we can have a whole nother conversation about whales and lobsters, and that would be another 15, 20 minutes. But there weren't even any whales around 50 million years ago. So, why take something that's not true and just say it like that? And then, but the much bigger untruth is that there's no such thing as sustainable fishery. That is not true either. And so, while I appreciate the attention being drawn to the really bad aspects of large-scale industrial fisheries, I'm really frustrated by the way the story was told. Some of my friends in communications might say, well, if you didn't tell it that way, it would never get any press. I hope that's not the case. I hope we don't have to, have wild inaccuracies, and sensationalism is the only way we'll get to action. I just don't, looking around at conservation today, I don't see that happening. I don't see young people responding in that way. So that's my sort of slightly abbreviated answer to your question about what I think about the film.
All right. Well, thank you. I had similar observations myself and actually walked away from it a little bit hopeful that although they weren't telling the story of success that you're conveying here today, we know that we're doing things better than they were being done, and we are striving to continue to do collaborative approaches to conservation while also allowing for prosperity. It's a balancing act. Well, Nancy Knowlton, I want to thank you very much for doing our talk today. Really appreciate that. And thanks to all the visitors who attended and your questions. I hope we got to all of them. We do this Lunch and Learn once a month, the last Friday of every month. And at the end of May, we'll be doing the next one, and that will be on the alewife fishery that Nancy talked about. Mike Talhauser from our staff will brief you on what's going on out in your community. And in fact, they're going on right now. The alewives are running a bit early this year. And so if you want to see restoration in action, go to a small stream along the coast of Maine and see what you can find.
I was wondering about that because there's a house on my way into Blue Hill, which once a year is covered with seagulls. Yeah. I thought, wow, it's a little early for them to be covered with seagulls. So that's the story. It's earlier than normal. Yeah, no, I encourage you all to go. It's just wonderful to watch those little fish jumping over the rocks, making their way to make another generation of fish. It's and to think that it was, it's one of those cases where we could have, lost the whole connection between the ocean and the freshwater if it weren't for the steps we took. I mean, it's a classic example of people getting together to make a difference. And there's actually a really interesting study by a colleague and former student of my husband's, Lauren McClenahan, who did a social science study of the people in the towns involved in alewife restoration. And what she showed was that it's not just the alewives that are doing better, that the whole social fabric of the community is improved by the return of the alewives. So it's a win-win for people and fish.
Very nice. Well, I hope this was a good optimistic way for people to finish your week and enjoy your time this weekend and get out and see some fish.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Nancy. We'll see you soon.
Thank you for having me.